Grace and I had been married for 6 years, and in those years, we had built something I was deeply proud of. We weren't flashy or extravagant, but we didn't need to be. We had each other, and that felt like enough. I worked as an electrical engineer for a solid company, and Grace worked as a nurse at a local clinic. Between our incomes, we lived comfortably, renting a small but cozy house on a quiet street with a white picket fence and a front yard where Grace planted a few flowers each spring. From the very beginning, Grace had this way of making the ordinary feel extraordinary. She was full of warmth, the kind of person who could brighten any room just by walking into it. Her smile, her laugh, they were things that stayed with you, things you carried with you even on the hardest days. We've been talking for months about starting a family, imagining what it would be like to have a little one running around, filling our home with laughter. Grace loved the idea of becoming a mom, and I couldn't wait to see her in that role. She was nurturing, kind, and patient, everything a great mother should be. Our mornings were some of my favorite moments. I'd wake up to the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the sound of Grace bustling around the kitchen. She had a habit of humming while she cooked, soft little tunes that were barely audible but somehow comforting. Most days, she'd make us breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, sometimes pancakes if she was feeling ambitious. I'd sit at the kitchen counter with my phone, catching up on the news or scrolling through work emails, while she moved around the kitchen, her hair tied up in a messy bun. We'd eat together, talking about the day ahead. Grace always asked about my work, even though I knew she didn't fully understand what I did as an electrical engineer. She'd listen anyway, nodding and smiling, and I'd do the same when she told me about her patients or her coworkers. Before she left for work, I'd walk her to the door, kiss her goodbye, and watch as she drove away in her little blue sedan. After work, our evenings were quiet but fulfilling. Grace would come home with stories from the clinic, sometimes funny, sometimes heartbreaking, and I'd share the challenges of my day. On good days, we'd cook dinner together, experimenting with recipes we'd find online, though Grace was much better at following instructions than I was. On lazier nights, we'd order takeout, spread out on the couch, and binge-watch our favorite shows. Grace had a soft spot for medical dramas, even though she'd constantly point out all the inaccuracies. I loved watching her get animated about them, her eyes lighting up as she ranted about how unrealistic something was. We weren't rich, but we dreamed big. Grace often talked about buying a house someday, something with a backyard where she could plant a garden. I loved the way her eyes lit up when she talked about it, the way she made it seem so real, so possible. We both wanted a family, and we spent countless evenings imagining what that would look like. Me teaching our kid how to ride a bike, Grace reading bedtime stories, the sound of tiny footsteps running down the hall. Life felt solid, steady. I thought we were building something unshakable, something that would last. It was a day like any other when everything started to shift. I just arrived at work, coffee in hand, ready to tackle a list of projects that seemed never-ending. My job as an electrical engineer wasn't glamorous, but I enjoyed the challenge of solving problems, working through schematics, and making sure everything ran smoothly. That day, though, I barely had time to settle into my desk before my phone buzzed with a call from the front office. "Jacob, the director wants to see you," the receptionist said, her tone giving away nothing. My mind raced as I made my way to his office. Had I done something wrong? Was there a problem with one of my projects? It wasn't every day that the director personally requested to speak with someone. When I stepped into his office, he greeted me warmly, gesturing for me to take a seat. The director, Mr. Lawson, was an older man with a calm demeanor, the kind of boss who rarely raised his voice but commanded respect with his presence. As he leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk, he addressed me directly. He said he'd been keeping an eye on my work and admitted he was impressed. He called me one of the most reliable engineers in the team, praising my unmatched attention to detail. I nodded, unsure where this was going. He continued speaking, his tone measured but firm. He explained that the company had recently taken on a significant project in California, a major contract that came with its own set of challenges. The team there was struggling, he said, and they needed leadership, someone with the right skills and experience to oversee the project. Then he made it clear. He trusted me to take on that role. I blinked, caught off guard. California? I repeated. He nodded firmly and acknowledged that it was a significant request. Then he outlined the offer in detail. The position would be temporary, lasting about a year and a half, and to make it worthwhile, he promised a salary increase to $12,000 a month. All travel and living expenses would be covered, and I'd have the opportunity to return home once a month. He assured me that I wouldn't be navigating this alone. His support would be unwavering throughout the process. I sat there, processing his words. The offer was generous, no doubt about it. An extra $4,500 a month could make a world of difference for Grace and me. We talked so often about saving for a house, about setting ourselves up for the future. This could be the opportunity we needed to make those dreams a reality. But the thought of being away from Grace for so long gave me pause. We'd never spent more than a few days apart since we got married. Could we handle the distance? Sensing my hesitation, Mr. Lawson leaned back slightly, his tone softening. He acknowledged that the decision wasn't an easy one and encouraged me to discuss it with my wife. He suggested I take the evening to think it over, but made it clear that he needed someone dependable for the role. His words carried weight as he emphasized that, in his eyes, I was the best candidate for the job. I left his office with a mix of emotions, flattered by his trust in me, tempted by the money, but anxious about what this would mean for my marriage. That evening, as Grace and I sat down to dinner, I told her about the offer. Her eyes widened as I explained the details, her fork frozen midway to her mouth. She looked at me with wide eyes and said that it was a lot of money. Her tone carried a mix of surprise and thoughtfulness, as if she was already starting to process the weight of the offer. I acknowledged her point, emphasizing that I understood. I pointed out how the extra income could really set us up for the future, help us save for the house we've been dreaming of, and even start a family without the constant weight of financial stress. But I didn't shy away from the reality of it, explaining that it would mean being away for long stretches, only making it back home once a month. Grace leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful as she weighed the situation. After a moment, she spoke with a calm resolve, acknowledging that it was only temporary. She reminded me of the many times we talked about making sacrifices to secure a better future. Her voice carried a quiet confidence as she assured me that if I believed I could handle the demands of this opportunity, she would stand by me and offer her full support. Her words were like a weight lifting off my chest. Grace had always been my rock, my biggest supporter. If she believed we could make this work, maybe we really could. We spent the rest of the evening talking it over, weighing the pros and cons. By the time we went to bed, we'd made a decision. I would take the job. It wouldn't be easy, but the extra income would be worth it. And besides, it was only temporary. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. I gave my notice to our landlord, packed up essentials, and arranged temporary housing in California. Grace insisted on helping with every detail, from organizing my travel to making sure I had a stocked pantry in my new apartment. Grace had looked at me with a reassuring smile, her voice steady as she told me not to worry about things at home. She wanted me to focus entirely on the job, promising that she'd take care of everything here. Her confidence was unwavering as she reminded me that we were a team and could handle this together. She made it sound so simple, but as the departure day loomed, the reality of leaving her hit me harder than I expected. Our last night together was bittersweet. We sat on the couch, sharing a bottle of wine and reminiscing about the little moments we'd taken for granted. The lazy Sunday mornings, the impromptu dinners out, the late-night conversations that stretched until dawn. As Grace rested her head on my shoulder, she whispered how much she was going to miss me. Her words carried the weight of our impending separation. I held her close, kissing her hair gently, and assured her that I would miss her even more. This wasn't just for me. It was for us, for the future we'd always dreamed of building together. The next morning, I left for the airport with a lump in my throat. Grace stood in the doorway, waving as I drove off, and for a moment, I questioned everything. Was this really the right decision? But the thought of the opportunities this would bring, financial security, a step closer to our dreams, kept me moving forward. California was as hectic as I'd expected. The new project was massive, and the team was under pressure to meet deadlines that seemed impossible. I threw myself into the work, often staying late at the office to ensure everything was on track. The days blurred together, a constant cycle of meetings, designs, and problem-solving. Despite the long hours, I made sure to call Grace every evening. Her voice was a lifeline, grounding me when the stress threatened to overwhelm me. She'd tell me about her day at the hospital, about the patients she'd cared for, and the small victories she'd celebrated. I could hear the strength in her voice, her determination to keep everything running smoothly back home. At the end of each call, Grace would remind me how proud she was. Her voice carried a quiet strength as she reassured me, telling me I was doing this for us. Her words were a constant anchor, keeping me focused on the reason behind all the sacrifices. Her words kept me going, even on the toughest days. But as the weeks turned into months, the distance began to take its toll. I missed her laugh, her touch, the way she'd curl up next to me at night. The phone calls weren't enough, and I found myself counting down the days until my monthly visits home. When I finally did come back, Grace would greet me at the door with open arms, her face lighting up like it was Christmas morning. We'd spend the weekends trying to make up for lost time, cooking together and savoring every moment we had. But as much as we tried to hold on to the magic, there was an undercurrent of strain that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. The nights were the hardest. Lying in bed next to her, I couldn't help but feel the weight of our separation. I'd reach out to hold her, as if trying to bridge the gap that had grown between us. She'd squeeze my hand and whisper, "I love you." But there was a hesitance in her voice that hadn't been there before. I told myself it was just the stress of the situation, that once the project was over, we'd find our way back to the life we'd built. A year had passed since I started working in California. It felt like time had both flown by and dragged on endlessly. The demands of the project grew heavier as deadlines loomed, and the once daily calls with Grace became less frequent. At first, we tried to stick to our ritual, her voice always a soothing reminder of what I was working toward. But life had a way of interfering. Sometimes she'd be caught up with shifts at the hospital, or I'd find myself so buried in work that by the time I looked at the clock, it was too late to call. Weeks blurred together. Before I knew it, 2.5 months had gone by without me making a trip home. The guilt gnawed at me, but I justified it by reminding myself of the end goal. This temporary sacrifice was for our future, wasn't it? Grace seemed to understand, though I couldn't help but notice a subtle shift in our conversations when we did talk. She was less animated, her words clipped and distant, but I chalked it up to the stress of being apart. When I finally found a brief window to take 3 days off, I decided to surprise her. Maybe it was an impulse, or maybe it was my way of reigniting the spark we'd shared before all of this. I pictured her face lighting up when I walked through the door unannounced, imagined how tightly she'd hug me, and how we'd laugh about me keeping the trip a secret. I landed in our city as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The excitement buzzing in my chest pushed aside the fatigue from the flight. On the way home, I stopped by a florist and picked up a bouquet of her favorite flowers, pink lilies, the one she always said reminded her of happiness. I also found a delicate silver pendant with a small heart-shaped charm at a nearby jewelry store. It wasn't extravagant, but I knew Grace preferred understated elegance. With the bouquet in one hand and the small velvet box tucked safely in my pocket, I hailed a taxi to take me to the house we'd called home for 6 years. As the car pulled up, the sight of the warm, familiar glow of the living room lights made my heart swell. I paid the driver, gathered my things, and walked up to the front door, quietly turning the key in the lock. The moment I stepped inside, the sound of soft music greeted me. It wasn't unusual for Grace to have music playing. She always said it made the house feel alive. But tonight, something felt different. As I walked toward the kitchen, I noticed the table was set, not in the casual way it usually was when she ate alone, but with care. 2 plates, 2 wine glasses, and a lit candle stood in the center of the table. My mind raced. How did she know I was coming? Was this all for me? A smile tugged at my lips as I imagined her anticipating my surprise, outwitting me with her own. I took a step toward the living room, eager to see her, to feel her in my arms again. But the moment I crossed the threshold, the world I knew shattered. Grace was there, sitting on the couch, but she wasn't alone. A man, unfamiliar and out of place in my home, was seated with her. No, not just seated. She was on his lap, her arms around his neck, their faces impossibly close. They were kissing. The bouquet slipped from my hand, the lilies tumbling to the floor in a quiet cascade. My breath caught in my throat, my chest tightening as if the air had been sucked out of the room. My vision blurred for a moment, as if my mind was refusing to process what my eyes were showing me. What the hell is going on? I shouted in a loud voice. Grace pulled away from her husband, frightened. Her wide eyes met mine, and for a split second, the world seemed to freeze. The music played on, a cruel contrast to the silence that fell between us. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the floor as the weight of betrayal crashed over me, threatening to drown me where I stood. For a moment, the room felt unnaturally quiet, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. My pulse thundered in my ears, a deafening rhythm that drowned out the music still playing in the background. Grace stood up abruptly, her lips moving as if to say something, but no words came. The man shifted uneasily on the couch, glancing between me and her like a kid caught stealing. "Jacob, Grace finally stammered, her voice trembling, but her words hit a wall of fury. "What the hell is this?" I roared, the sound of my voice breaking through the suffocating silence. My chest heaved with each breath as I pointed at the man. "Who the hell is he?" I watched the man stand up, raising his hands in a defensive motion. He looked so smug, which only made my anger flare up. He told me to relax, but it only made my frustration build. He said he didn't want any problems, but I could hear the underlying challenge in his words. I stepped forward. I told him that he was sitting on my couch in my house with my wife, and they were kissing each other like it was just some casual fling. I turned to Grace, my heart breaking with every word that left my mouth, as I asked how she could do this to me. Grace stepped in front of me, her eyes wide with panic as she tried to stop me, pleading for me to listen. She stammered out that she could explain. I cut her off, my voice rising with every word. What was there to explain? Grace was sitting on another man's lap, while I was out there breaking my back for us. The betrayal hit me like a knife, sharp and unforgiving, but the pain quickly gave way to anger. I couldn't hold back. This wasn't just about us. It was about everything I'd done for her. The man smirked, his demeanor oozing indifference, as if the scene unfolding before him was nothing more than an inconvenience. He shrugged, his words casual and cutting. He told me I could take her back if I wanted her so badly, dismissing the situation as if it were trivial. Then, in a contemptuous tone that made my blood boil, he began to say something vile about my wife, something I didn't even let him finish. He didn't get to finish. My fist hit his jaw, almost instinctively, without a second thought. The man stumbled and landed on the coffee table, causing the magazines and glass to fall to the floor. He groaned, trying to push me away, but I was too far gone, the rage consuming every ounce of control I had left. Grace screamed, her voice frantic and desperate, begging me to stop. I wasn't finished. With one last shove, I dragged him to the front door, flung it open, and tossed him out onto the porch. My voice was low and venomous as I told him he'd regret it if I ever saw him there again. The man scrambled to his feet, clutching his jaw, muttering curses under his breath as he hurried away into the night. I slammed the door shut, leaning against it for a moment as I tried to catch my breath. The silence in the room was deafening now, broken only by the faint hum of the music still playing. I turned, my eyes locking onto Grace, who was now trembling, her face streaked with tears. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice breaking. I said nothing, walking past her into the kitchen. My hands shook as I opened the cabinet, pulled out a bottle of whiskey, and poured a generous amount into a glass. I just tipped the glass back and let the sharp burn slide down my throat. I carried the glass into the living room, sitting heavily on the couch. The weight of everything that had just happened pressed down on me, suffocating and relentless. Grace knelt in front of me, her hands trembling as she reached for mine. Her voice was barely audible through her sobs as she apologized, repeating over and over how sorry she was. She begged me for forgiveness, her desperation cutting through the air like a plea I wasn't sure I could answer. Her tears fell freely, soaking the fabric of my jeans as she clung to me, her fingers gripping my hand as though letting go would shatter her entirely. She said she hadn't meant for any of this to happen, insisting it was a mistake and that he didn't mean anything to her. She begged me to believe her, swearing she loved me, that she'd always loved me. I stared at her, my jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Her words felt hollow, her tears a cruel reminder of the betrayal I'd just witnessed. I wanted to yell, to scream, to demand answers, but the exhaustion was creeping in, dulling the edges of my anger. Grace's sobs grew louder as she pressed her forehead against my hand. She begged me not to leave her, her voice raw with desperation. She promised she'd do anything to make things right, pleading for just one chance, just one, to fix what she had broken. I downed the rest of the whiskey in one long gulp, the warmth doing little to ease the coldness spreading through me. My gaze fixed on the empty glass in my hand, unable to look at her, unable to process what the hell I was supposed to do next. I sat there on the couch for what felt like an eternity, staring at the empty glass in my hand, my mind a mess of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. Grace was still on her knees in front of me, sobbing uncontrollably, her pleas becoming quieter but no less desperate. Her voice, hoarse from crying, broke through the silence as she whispered my name again. She begged me not to leave, pleading with a desperation that clung to every word. She admitted she'd made a terrible mistake, but insisted we could fix it, if only I'd let her try. I didn't respond. My chest felt like it was caving in, the weight of everything too much to bear. Without a word, I set the glass down on the coffee table and stood. Panic rose in her voice as she asked where I was going. She scrambled to her feet, reaching for me, but I stepped away, heading for the door. She cried out, her voice pleading, begging me not to walk away from her as she grabbed my arm. I froze for a moment, her touch like fire against my skin. My jaw clenched, my fists tightening at my sides. Slowly, I turned to look at her. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes swollen and red. But all I could see was the image of her on that couch with him. The betrayal was burned into my mind, a wound that felt too deep to heal. I muttered quietly, my voice barely above a whisper, that I couldn't do this right now. She shook her head, her grip on my arm tightening as she begged me not to leave like this. She pleaded for me to talk to her, insisting that I could yell at her if I needed to, but that I couldn't just shut her out. I pulled my arm free, not roughly, but firmly. I told her I needed to leave without meeting her eyes. Then I opened the door and stepped out into the night, leaving her sobbing behind me. She followed me to the porch, calling my name, but I didn't look back. My feet carried me down the driveway and onto the street, where I flagged down a cab. The driver must have sensed my mood because he didn't say a word, just nodded when I told him to take me to the nearest bar. The bar was dimly lit and half empty, the kind of place where people went to disappear. I found a stool at the far end of the counter and ordered a double whiskey. The bartender gave me a long look before sliding the glass over, but he didn't ask any questions. I drank in silence, the alcohol dulling the edges of my anger, but doing little to soothe the ache in my chest. I didn't think about where I was going to sleep that night, didn't think about what I'd do tomorrow. All I knew was that I couldn't go back to that house. Not now, maybe not ever. By the time the bar closed, I was more numb than drunk. I found a cheap motel nearby and crashed on the lumpy bed, staring at the ceiling until exhaustion finally pulled me under. The next morning, I booked the earliest flight back to California. I didn't even stop by the house to pack more clothes. I didn't want to risk seeing her. As the plane took off, I stared out the window, my thoughts a chaotic mess. For the next few weeks, I buried myself in work. Grace called every day, sometimes multiple times. When I didn't answer, she started sending texts. Long messages filled with apologies and pleas for forgiveness. Promises to do better. Descriptions of how much she missed me. I ignored them all. Every time her name popped up on my phone, a fresh wave of anger and pain washed over me. I couldn't face her, couldn't deal with the mess of emotions she stirred in me. So I focused on work, pulling longer hours and volunteering for extra projects just to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how busy I stayed, I couldn't escape the memories. The sound of her laughter, The way her eyes lit up when she smiled. The way she used to wait up for me when I worked late. All of it haunted me. On what would have been our wedding anniversary, she left me a voicemail. Her voice was shaky, full of raw emotion. She admitted she knew she had hurt me, her voice filled with regret. She confessed that she didn't feel she deserved another chance, but she couldn't give up on us. She told me I was the love of her life, and that she'd do whatever it took to make things right. With desperation in her voice, she begged me to just tell her what to do. I deleted the voicemail without responding, but her words stuck with me. It was a few weeks later, late one Friday afternoon. The office was unusually quiet, most of my coworkers having already left for the weekend. I sat at my desk, staring at the endless spreadsheets on my screen but not really seeing them. My mind had wandered back to Grace again, to the sound of her voice in that voicemail. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. Then, out of nowhere, my phone buzzed on the desk. It was an unknown number. I almost didn't pick up, figuring it was another spam call, but something compelled me to answer. Hello? There was a pause, then a familiar voice. Jacob, it's me. Grace. My chest tightened, and I immediately felt a mix of anger, sadness, and confusion wash over me. She told me in a steady but quiet voice that she was in California, near my building. I shot up from my chair, my heart pounding as I tried to process what she had said. I couldn't believe it. How had she found me here? I was shocked, wondering how the hell she managed to track me down. She explained that she had gone to the company and got the address from my boss. She knew I'd been avoiding her, and she didn't want to ambush me like this, but she needed to see me. Her voice was desperate as she begged for just 5 minutes. She promised that if I still wanted her gone after that, she would leave, and I would never hear from her again. I rubbed my temples, trying to calm the storm raging inside me. This was insane, I muttered to myself, but despite my better judgment, I found my feet moving toward the elevator. When I stepped outside, there she was. She stood by the curb, clutching a small bag and a framed photo, her eyes locking onto mine the moment I appeared. She looked tired, her face pale and drawn, but there was a determination in her expression that caught me off guard. 5 minutes, I said coldly, crossing my arms. She nodded and took a hesitant step forward, holding out the photo. It was from our wedding day, the two of us smiling so brightly it was hard to believe those were the same people standing here now. Her voice shook as she began, admitting she'd said it 100 times already. She told me she was sorry, that she had been selfish and had let me down in the worst possible way. She promised it would never happen again. I clenched my jaw, refusing to look at her. Grace, you can't just show up here and expect me to. She interrupted me, pulling something else out of her bag, a leather-bound diary. She explained that she had filled its pages with entries, starting from the day I left. Among the pages was a letter, long and filled with apologies and reflections on everything that had happened. She admitted she had been writing letters to me every single day since I left. She knew I might not care anymore, but she needed me to understand how much I meant to her and how deeply she regretted everything. She held out the notebook, her hands trembling. For a moment, I considered walking away, but something in her eyes stopped me. Reluctantly, I took it from her. Her voice broke as she continued, admitting she couldn't undo what she had done, but she wanted to show me she was willing to fight for us, to prove that she was still the woman I had fallen in love with. She pleaded with me to just read the letter. I stared at the notebook, the weight of it heavy in my hands. A part of me wanted to throw it back at her, to tell her to leave and never come back. But another part, the part that still remembered the way she used to look at me, the way she'd been my rock when times were tough, hesitated. Finally, I sighed, agreeing to read it. I told her, though, that it didn't mean everything was okay. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, a faint glimmer of hope in her expression. She whispered that it was all she was asking for. Without another word, I turned and walked back into the building, leaving her standing there. That night, in the solitude of my apartment, I opened the notebook. The first entry was dated the day I'd walked out, and it was raw and emotional, filled with regret and self-loathing. By the time I reached the last entry, it was well past midnight. I closed the notebook and sat there in silence, my emotions a tangled mess. The next day, I called her. When she answered, her voice was hesitant, as if she didn't believe it was really me. I told her simply that I had read it. She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "And?" I admitted that I didn't know what it meant for us, but that I thought we needed to talk. Grace stayed in California for the next week, and we spent hours talking, really talking, about everything that had happened. It wasn't easy, but for the first time in months, I felt that we had finally become closer to each other. Weeks turned into months, and Grace's determination to fix things never wavered. She stayed in California, living nearby, giving me space but always gently reminding me she wasn't giving up. Slowly, I started to soften. We'd bump into each other, share brief conversations, and eventually, I let her in again. One night, I found myself at her apartment, not sure why I was there. But when she opened the door and smiled, I knew something had shifted. A few months later, I asked Grace to move back in. She agreed, tears in her eyes, and for the first time in a long while, our home felt right again. A year later, we welcomed our daughter, May. It felt like a fresh start, a symbol of everything we'd fought through. Watching Grace with our baby, I realized just how much I loved her, how much I'd always loved her, even when I was angry. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours. We'd survived the hardest test of our relationship, and now, we were building something new. Our family was complete again, and that was enough.